thank you all for coming tonight. It's so great to be here, and it's so great to be here with my old friend Zac Posen. I think we've known each other for nearly a decade, if not a decade, but we've been friends for a very, very long time. I've also interviewed him many times at CNN when I was covering fashion. So I learned a lot, actually, Zac, in doing research for this. You know, I thought I knew everything there was to know about you, but clearly I didn't. So I always like to start sort of at the beginning, you know, when you were just a little tot and you were interested in fashion. And I learned today that you got interested at a very young age, and you actually stole yarmulkes from the synagogue to make dresses for dolls. And I thought I was misreading it, but then I saw it several times, so I knew it had to be true, right, Zac?
Partially true.
Okay.
Yeah, a little bit. Okay, so, you know, at a very young age, you know, fashion, theater was something that was very interesting to me. And my father is a painter and an artist, and I think there was always fabric around. I grew up on Spring Street, and walking our dog, there were still cutting rooms in Soho, so you had the negative rolls of fabric, the negative space of patterns cut out. And that was sort of the play tool. So, you know, when we'd walk the dog, you know, I'd get the tools and materials for my figurines to play with. I had an incredible older sister, Alexandra, and so, you know, and my dad's studio was half of our living space, of our loft, and still is where they live. And so, you know, I could express myself, I guess, at an early age through building things with my hands. I mean, glue guns were something not unfamiliar for me at a very young age.
But you said at a young age, too, as a boy, that you were ashamed.
Well, I think it was odd.
That you were ashamed of being interested in fashion, so you obviously got over that.
Well, you know, I either wanted to be, surprise, a baker, so I had like that as a middle name at one point. I think I just really liked playing with like the Sculpey or Fimo clay or, you know, plasticine and making it look like pastries. Or I, you know, was interested in an idea of fashion. I don't think I really was aware of runway, you know, and then I start to look through early sketchbooks and reflection now on trips, and I'm drawing like knit collection. I mean, it's way more organized than my process now. You know, it's all merchandised. So this idea of costume or expression through clothing, I think, was there pretty early, and then I wanted to be a performer. So I mean, that's the really, you know, I you know, wanted to be a song and dance kid. I think, you know, musical theater was something valued in my household. You know, I got taken to a lot of theater in New York, from pretty obscure experimental theater to, you know, Stephen Sondheim.
So why didn't you do that?
Because my voice changed at 18. And I became a baritone. First, I was always a tenor, and then I became a baritone, and then a baritone, and it just wasn't, there was just not that many there weren't great roles that I felt at the time felt like me. I don't know, or I didn't think at the time there were interesting musical theater being written. But, you know, I went to, like, you know, musical theater camps and all of this.
You did the whole
I did that whole thing, and, you know, and I loved that. And I think when I got to high school was the first time that I didn't get I went to a really special high school. I guess
St. Anne's.
St. Anne's in Brooklyn Heights, at a really amazing time with quite an incredible collection.
Classmates with Lena Dunham.
Well, she was younger.
Among others.
That was my high school job, was taking her to school on the subway, in the NNR train, and making her perform the news for the train car.
It's amazing.
We'd put a clip in her hair and comb it, and then she'd have to tell the commuters from that would go, I guess, from New Jersey, taking the PATH train down to Wall Street that connects, with the same people in our car, like every day. So they became sort of familiar over 4 years.
Her first audience.
I'm sure she had an audience her whole life. But you know, I went there and I didn't get a role in. I got cast as a River City youth in The Music Man. And that was sort of like, wah, wah. And that was sort of like, that was sort of done, and they had a great costume department.
If I can't be the best.
Yeah, you know, not even like, you know. So it was, you know, from that, and so it sort of just, it phased out, and at that point I also had a lot of incredible
mentors
and girlfriends that were already working in fashion.
So,
and that was odd. I mean, reflecting back on it, you know, I grew up in Lower Manhattan. All I ever knew of my friends were people whose parents were artists.
right.
That's, you know, I didn't really grow up above 14th Street. That was no man's land except for an excursion to the museum or, you know, the dentist.
Well, you just moved uptown. Exactly. He just moved uptown, by the way, which is a very big deal after being in Tribeca for many years. And we'll talk about that. But I want to talk a little bit about, you know, the early years, because you've often been called the boy wonder. You know, as a sophomore in high school, correct me if I'm wrong along the way, but you interned for Nicole Miller. You had a great mentor at the Costume Institute at the Met. You went on to Parsons. And then, even though you were accepted to Brown University, which I did not know, smarty pants, you went to Central St. Martin's in London, which
that was a big
was,
issue for my parents.
I'm sure, but they supported you.
They did.
And, but then, you know, you had all this incredible training and these amazing mentors, but really it wasn't until 2000 and you designed this gown for Naomi Campbell that you really got the attention of people. How did that happen?
Well, my best friend from high school, who was a model, and her name's Lola, and
Schnabel.
Lola Schnabel, and my second year, I skipped a year of college moving to London. I mean, that was really the catalyst for, like, this is the place to go. I got to skip a year of university in the UK, which is pretty cool and rare.
Right.
And so my second year at school, my friend, you know, Lola was my roommate. She was going to art school there. And I was making clothing, and she was wearing a dress, and, you know, she has an incredible mother. Unbelievable style icon, and, you know, she brought Azadine Alaya to America and had the store where the APC store is now. That's why the floors are so good there. And the mirrors. That's the original Alaya store in New York. And I remember being a kid and walking by with my mom and stuff, thinking who could fit into the itsy bitsiest little knit dresses possible. But so she'd grown up with Azadine, and I guess she was going to Paris at some point on the Eurostar, and Naomi saw a dress that I had made on her and said, I want it, I need it, you know, how can I get it? And so one day, and I was living in a basement apartment in Bloomsbury. You know, these legs were walking down the stairs, a bag that said NC on it, and she gave me her perfume, which was very sexual bottle, like, you know, futuristic, I don't know, you know, sort of in between, it's an amazing bottle anyhow. You guys can find it, I'm sure, online of what it looks like, and a book of my life with Mandela.
Wow.
And then the fitting started, and, you know, she gave me, you know, some pounds in hand to buy fabric, and I was buying them at sort of the street market on Barrack Street, which is a fruit market, but there were some fabric markets, and started doing fittings with her.
And then she wore the gown.
She wore the gown, but it was never in press.
It wasn't?
No,
oh,
the photo of the dress wasn't in press, and at the same time...
But it was passed around.
This dress got passed around, and I remember them telling me, you know, this is too... They thought I was so commercial at St. Martin's.
Oh,
yeah,
interesting.
Extreme
really?
Commercial, you know, I think, and I had a great mentor of a teacher there. You know, it's an interesting school. It's not like you have classes. You get assignments, you can touch base with your teachers, and then you get critiqued in front of the entire school. You have your grades put onto the front of...
At the end.
The grades are just there, and they just stay there your whole time, and you owe it you know, almost the class always failed everything. And it's pretty hardcore. There are amazing technical pattern-making teachers there. There's not necessarily pattern-making classes, but if you're there, you can work with them.
But do you remember what was going through your mind at the time? I mean, you must have been 20 years old, and you're fitting Naomi Campbell. Weren't you freaking out?
Yeah, I was 19 or something. Yeah, no. I don't think I was freaking out. I think I was excited. I think it seemed, you know, it seemed, you know, she's just one of the most beautiful women in the world. It's just, you know, I can stare at every like part of her body for hours. It's impeccable, her body, and she also knows how to hold her body in different ways to make clothing fit and bias. And I was, you know, from my time at the Costume Institute, I was obsessed with Madeleine Vianney, deeply obsessed with this idea of an empowered femininity through glamour.
And you also, to this day, you still learn a lot from Naomi, don't you?
Oh, she's great. I mean, she's a very close friend, and you know, she's part of my family, and I really value that friendship. And it's, you know, that's one of the wonderful parts of fashion, is that you can have these, you know, long-term friendships. But London was just an amazing experience. I was open-eyed. I was ambitious. You know, I just wanted to take it in. And, you know, sort of on touchdown there, I became friends and met sort of serendipitously incredible people. I became really close with a woman who was really like my second mom there, this woman, Anita Pallenberg. And she said, "You want to come to a party with me?" And I said, "Sure." You know, and I dressed sort of, I also had a look. I mean, that's the other thing, is it was definitely practice. While Alina was doing the news, I was practicing how to get noticed. So, I mean, I went to school in crazy outfits.
Well, you've mastered it.
Now it's very toned down, but, you know, it was sort of like dandy punk. I had ivy in my hair and feathers every day, and it was a look. So I think that picked out to certain kinds of people, but, you know, I was able to explore in London, you know, all the great castles and with the families, and I really engrossed myself and met really special people there, and became really familiar with Ozzie Clarke and his work, and Jean Muir. And, you know...
And then you graduated.
No, I didn't graduate.
You didn't graduate from Central St. Martin's.
No.
You left, you came back.
Well, yeah, there was press. Press started, people had seen it, the New York Times wrote a big piece. And from there, that had trickle effect, and I was making these sort of t-shirts with leather epaulets and velvet trim that I would tea-dye and stain, and I was selling them at... I first took them to one store where... you know, they didn't take them. That was called Pineal Eye, and I guess, you know, there was a moment there, which was sort of carrying all the young designers, and they took them, and they started to sell them. And
this was before you launched launched a fashion show. Which, by the way, when you came back to New York, did your parents really put you on a $15 allowance?
Well, there wasn't. Listen, I was living there. My mom at that point had stopped working. And as we all know, it's really hard to make a living as an artist. You know, I think that, you know, my mom became a lawyer so that she could send my sister and I to really good schools. But that's where it went, you know? So that's, I think, you know, growing up in Soho, or people's idea of sort of where I grew up is interesting, or, you know, who that was. But, you know, that was it. You know, and that's what they valued, was education. And I really feel very lucky to have had that's what they valued.
The Koreans and the Jews are very similar that way. Value education, family.
So yeah, when I came back, I was living on, you know, I came back, I wanted to do some internships, and I put this beautiful box together, and at that point, you know, I was really engrossed into the East London scene. At that point, I was living with an emerging photographer, Vanina Sorrenti, who's Maria's sister, and she was becoming a photographer, and we were really fully engrossed in a very underground scene in the, you know, the Jefferson Hack, East London world. You know, and these contacts are people that I wasn't aware, they were just friends.
Right.
But these were major players, and then I remember at one point when I felt the confidence in London to leave, is my dear roommate, she had broken a tooth, and Lucinda Chambers was sitting in my living room, and I had to entertain her and keep her stalled for 2 hours. And Vanina came back and just saw, you know, this dialogue. I went into presentation mode, and then at that point, Julie Gilhart at the time from Barney's flew to London, and I didn't know her, and she flew to London to come see the pieces, and I put on like an impromptu performance piece in different rooms in the house.
And she liked it.
She liked it, but there was no production, there was no company. I think the press probably at that point seemed bigger than she was expecting, but she liked it. And I didn't get the internship I wanted to. So at that point, there was a retailer who had a store called Baguda in New York. And Mark Baguda, I had a message on my machine, you know, I want to be your partner. And so I went on a buying trip with him in Europe. So at that point, through that buying trip, I had met all the retailers.
Wow.
You know, the great one, the Mary Louises of the world. You know,
right.
Really, at that point when specialty were really the leaders.
And is it at that point then you decided, I'm
no,
going to
I
make
came back.
this?
I didn't really know what I was going to do yet. You know, I would love to start something, but there was no trust fund to start anything, or you know, I didn't know. You know, I didn't come from fashion, and you know, so basically we were reading this contract, and what the financials just didn't make sense, and so I thought, you know, let's try to do this on our own. And at that point, when I asked my mom to read this contract is when she came on board, and I asked my sister to direct this impromptu fashion show. And at that point, Henry Bendels and Anna Gardner, I think at the time, and Ed Burstell were there, and sort of the chain went up, like the junior, the second, little bit more senior, and then finally the president of the store and fashion director were coming, and I did a full show that was very theatrical with sort of my girlfriends, all different races, body types, representing the brand, coming out, and they said, we want to buy it. And I said, this is fabric, I can't produce this. This is, you know, the leftover fabrics from a market, from London. Wow. Let me sketch you a collection. And at that point, two things happened. 9/11 happened about 4 days later. And the second thing that happened was, right after that, is my mom did something very smart that made our business able to function in the beginning. We went away.
What?
My mom smartly negotiated 50% upon order so that we could finance making the collection.
Very smart.
And that had not been
Susan
done
Posen's
since the
a
70s.
smart
But it was
woman.
the only way. And at that point, because of 9/11, and the community that I was working with at the time, a really great designer who had become a friend, Miguel Adrover, you know, sort of through venture capitalism, had his company cut. And there was a huge, very grand studio on the Bowery, Lower Bowery, that had been built, and everybody was out of work. And the industry was out of work. So two things. Because of this horrible tragedy and this standstill, the factories needed work, and they would take small runs. And people were willing to come work for us for free on the potential that something could happen. And people who were in other fields, who now are like leaders of different companies, came from their other fields and started working for something that they were passionate about coming forward to. Mm-hmm. And we started in their living room, and then I did a Gen Art, and then we produced this collection and put it in Gen Art, and at that point, I think Cal Ruttenstein saw it. I was terrified.
Well, you staged your first collection in 2002 in a former synagogue. Way to come full circle with the yarmulkes. You were quickly declared fashion's next big thing.
That was an overwhelming show. I mean, it was a very pure vision.
Right.
The clothing, I made it with one sewer and one pattern maker /
But I mean, I think we should remind people that you were 22 years old at the time. 21. Okay, you were 21. Nonetheless, no difference. I mean, you were very, very young. You know, I mean, that's a lot of pressure, isn't it? And a lot on your shoulders at such a young age. I mean, how did you, looking back on it?
It was really pure. I mean, I was making the pieces. I had an idea at that point I was very engrossed and friends with all the models that were in that show, but I still had to do general casting, and there was no show production. You know, we asked a friend to do it, and then they did it, a guy named Dean, and at that point I asked another friend, John Frusciante of Red Hot Chili Peppers, to write original music. I mean, I
want to touch on that a little bit, because
creative people find each other in the world.
Right, but so. I think you have have I don't want to say used, but you have been fortunate that you've had incredible people in your life and incredible women in your life.
Yes.
You know, starting with your mother Susan, your sister Alexandra, but beyond that,
girlfriends.
I mean, you know, we saw each other 2 nights ago, and I said, you know, Zach, I think the first time I ever saw one of your dresses was on, well, I said Claire Danes, but it was actually Natalie Portman on David Letterman years and years ago, and I remember, because I love fashion, I remember the dress so vividly, and it was the first time I had ever heard Zach's name. And I mean, those were the early days. Do you remember that?
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really, I mean, I was living at home on the couch. My studio was there. It was the showroom too.
Were you watching it as it was happening? Did you see it when it was on?
Oh, the airing? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was a big moment. Natalie had worn a dress from the first show, and I met her. There were 2 kids that grew up in my building in Soho, and his name is Zeke, so we're the 2 Z's that grew up on Spring Street, Zeke and Zach, and he was a child prodigy growing up. I was I had ADD, I was dyslexic, so I couldn't read till much later. At 3 years old, he would be reading me the chapter book to The Wizard of Oz.
Wow.
And he ended up going to Harvard and being in academics, and he was in class with Natalie Portman, and one day, you know, he said, I have a friend, and the day before she came to visit and came downstairs to try on clothing, I had to make a very big decision between another actress and her.
Really?
I think I made the right decision.
Well, yes, you did make the right decision, but
Another actress wanted to take the collection for a 6-month press tour.
Not a good
I
idea.
couldn't do it.
But you've had the benefit of having lots of very high-profile women in your life as friends and as supporters. You know,
Well, I love women. I want to empower them.
Naomi, Claire Danes, Lena Dunham. I mean, Uma Thurman. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. And I mean, these are women that you, Lucy Liu, that you not only dress, but you will walk the red carpet with them. You're friends with them. You know, how soon?
I also have non-famous friends.
You have lots of non-famous friends too. Yes, that's true. But you had the benefit of having famous friends who would wear your clothes at a time when you were trying to make a name for yourself. How important and impactful was that for you?
Well, I think there was an amazing. I think it was extremely impactful, and I think that there was major impact on that and major pushback early on from that. I think people, some people, it definitely got attention, but I also think at that point, the build was so big. And I think that, you know, when I had my first show, and it was, you know, the reaction was pretty over the top, and I saw that pretty quickly. And I realized, and it made me a little bit, at that point, skeptical of the industry, because I thought, you know,
Why?
I didn't think it was as great as they felt it was, at all.
Interesting.
And, you know, to have people like Susie Menkes, you know, I remember at the first show screaming, you know, this is the next Yves Saint Laurent. Those are big statements. You know, people went cuckoo, you know. Anna was there and she, you know, sort of stood up and gave an ovation, and I hadn't met her yet.
Wow.
And, you know, it was a moment. And I saw that, and it made me scared, and then it made me shift to realizing, well, they didn't see, you know, I could critique it to death.
Right, but then, I mean, and by your own admission, you know, you were very young at the time, but you...
But it was pure. It was a pure fiction.
And
very theatrical.
It was, and I remember those shows.
They were long. It was like a 30-minute show.
I mean, they were spectacles, and they were pretty amazing. I'm sure some of you in the room have been to some of them.
Bigger.
And they grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And
but we fully paid for our shows through sponsorship.
Congratulations. That's amazing.
That's how you do it, if you, I mean, from an entrepreneurial standpoint.
Because those shows are expensive. They're hundreds of thousands of dollars. But,
they can.
But one thing that you did do, which we've talked about on CNN, but I'd like for you to address this, because, you know, in 2010 you took your collection to Paris. Mm-hmm. And you had this now famous quote where you said...
This is a misquote.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm gonna cut the quote.
Okay.
And I will explain situationally. I think there had been such a big rise. We were facing an economic recession at that time. You know, I think that the building pressures upon myself and my company were so high, and, you know, no matter how much we were producing and growing, it wasn't enough.
Mm.
And I mean, that's part of growing pains. And I was trying to find, I think, my creative voice at that point, because we were so in the public eye and there were so many voices. I was working with an amazing PR company, KCD,
right,
who had taken me on originally pro bono, and at this point they were not, and it was a business, you know, and it was a great relationship, and I had a quarter more people in my company than I do even today, and it was just big. And I think what kind of clothing we made, and we were showing in the large tent at Lincoln Center, and those shows got, I mean, you went to, they were enormous shows. I was aware early on that there was going to be this big, like, New York socialite thing, so we were really early on that, and sort of pop cult, you know, I just understood that mixing high-low at shows, and it would be an interesting selection of mix, and it became like a rock show.
Right, and it was.
And people didn't see the clothing, no matter if it was good, bad, scary.
They were truly, truly spectacles. So you made this decision in 2010 to take your collection to Paris.
Well, my schedule, sorry, I really think there's good clarity to be made, is that at that point, I had always showed on Thursday, and at that point, there was no more Thursday schedule available for me. So before Paris, I showed in New York for 2 seasons at 9 a.m. in the morning on Monday morning, the first day of Fashion Week, which means a 4 a.m. call time, which means your company for alterations has to go for 2 days straight. And quite frankly, editors or anybody, thank you, Alina, for coming to this, really wants to be at a 9 a.m. show before a 10 a.m. Herrera show when you're not an advertiser.
Well, it's not exactly the best time slot.
And I mean, you know, it was hard, and it was either that or tail-ending fashion. And I knew that I couldn't tail-end fashion because we were in an advertiser, and I'd lose all my internationals, which was half of my business.
But the only reason why I mentioned Paris, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm just saying, so I really had no choice, and the Champs Syndicales invited me and said, you know, and at this point it was sort of make or break, and it's like, you gotta take risks in life.